Okay, in this video we discuss Plato's teleology, and teleology just means essentially a final goal. That there is a final state or state of perfection, right, to which we must attain. If there is an ideal realm in, way out there above the heavens, that is uncaused and eternal, and we are copies or shadows of that world, then naturally Plato is going to come to the conclusion that we have to attain to this seemingly static, perfect, freeze-dried state called the good, with a capital G. It's sort of like, it's kind of like the Platonic version of, Santa Claus. Since here we are at Christmas time, we'll just use a Santa Claus analogy. It's like the good is like, Santa poring over his list of children on his granddaddy armchair at the North Pole in front of a fire, determining which kid was naughty and which one was nice, and who gets to attain to the good and who doesn't. Who has attained to the good and who hasn't. It's a very moralistic approach, and moralism is very dualistic. It's innately dualistic because it sees its ontology, its ethical ontology, basically has this very, very black and white distinction between the good and evil. And this requires a lot of nuancing. So I don't want to get into the details of it right now. I don't want to get into the details of theodicy. I've broken it down a little bit in the past when I've critiqued the Abrahamic view, especially as it pertains to Yahweh's behavior. There's a lot more we could discuss philosophically than that, but I don't want to get into it right now. For the time being, let me be clear that I'm not espousing, by denying that there is a dualistic separation between good and evil, I'm at the same time not suggesting that ethics is relative. I'm not espousing relativism. But anyway, we've already looked at why Plato's ideal realm can't exist, and why it results in a duality that is reminiscent of the duality that Christianity fails to overcome with its doctrine of the incarnation. So in that is the case, then it follows that Plato's teleology is also wrong, because his whole teleology is based on the existence of this transcendent ideal realm. Now, what does that mean for us eschatologically, or in terms of what it means? Does that mean we will never be self-realized? Does that mean there's no such state as perfected self-realization? And that reality is just basically, essentially, dog eat dog, right? And might makes right. No, because I would say Self-realization is conformity to the image after which we were manifested. And we were manifested in the image of God. God having a spirit and a body, which we also have. And we also reflect him in terms of the sexes, the distinction between the male sex and female sex, in that God has two poles. He has a polarity that can be described as masculine and feminine. Those are the two obvious ones. There are other things we could try to delineate, but just for the purpose of our video here, that's all we really need to point out. By conforming to that image, we conform to perfection, and that perfection involves overcoming the false ego, overcoming attachments, being connected but without being attached. So it doesn't mean you can't enjoy, or that you can't enjoy pleasures such as eating and drinking or having sexual relations, but it does mean that you will do so in a detached manner. And again, I have to emphasize that being detached does not mean being disconnected from the activity or from the person that you are in communion with. So self-realization is overcoming attachment, overcoming false ego, false perception, and by false perception, I mean spiritual ignorance, particularly, well, I would say that all ignorance in that sense manifests itself every time in some manner or other of duality. So our thinking or our activity, when our thinking or activity embodies a pattern of behavior or acting that betrays some conformity to dualism. Once we have risen above all of that, not just in our minds intellectually, not just in comprehending that truth, but in terms of embodying it consistently and permanently, which is self-realization. Well, permanently more or less. I'll get to that in a moment. There is a separate question of whether we somehow attain to a permanent body. Do we attain to a perfect form? I don't think that's necessarily the case. Well, it can't be. It can't be if Plato is wrong. So I would say that just as Gregory of Nyssa taught among in the Eastern Christian tradition, that in the eschaton we would grow everlastingly, we would move everlastingly towards God and grow in him, her, not that he thought of God as a her, everlastingly, without while in this while remaining in our individuality, so not dissolving in our individuality and being swallowed up by the infinite, in moving towards God everlastingly without having our individuality swallowed up by the infinite. I do not see why there could not be an infinite array of forms that we evolve into as we draw closer and closer to that image. And okay, now I get to the part in the discussion where I qualify what I meant by maybe, as far as the permanence of self-realization. I believe that as persons, we have absolute free will. Now, when I say absolute free will, I don't mean that our choices are not conditioned in countless ways by our environment and by our internal constitution in terms of our likes and dislikes and preferences and a host of other things. 99% of the things that we do and the choices that we make are conditioned by all of that. And so in a way, our choices are very much determined. But free will, as I would define it, is doing that which you want to do. And typically, unless we have a gun to our heads, or we've simply gone insane mentally, we are doing precisely what it is that we want to do. If we weren't doing precisely what it was that we wanted to do, it would mean that we are acting utterly randomly. And our experience shows that we do not act or choose in a random, haphazard manner. So I believe that determinism and free will are compatible with one another. With that said, I think there is that little bit of area where we can make choices outside of that determined box. But even then, the one, which is infinite, encompasses any combination of choices that all the beings in the world make and all the activities that we engage in. So no scenario, no cosmic scenario can surprise God, because it is all encompassed within him. All possibilities are encompassed within him. That being the case, I do think it is potentially possible for a being to advance far in self-realization and for whatever reason choose to descend back to some lower level. But that isn't determined. In other words, I'm not arguing that there is a deterministic cycle which guarantees that every being, after it attains to self-realization, has to at some point, quote unquote, fall again and redo that same cycle repeatedly and endlessly. That is not the position I'm taking. Because we start out in ignorance, and we have to learn the hard way through many difficult experiences, and we have to engage in self-imposed suffering due to our choices and thought patterns before we can, and go through potentially seemingly endless reincarnations before we are able to be self-realized. All of that accumulated experience adds up to a general trajectory towards God, in which we've reached a maturity that will not allow us to descend again once we understand the implications of where we've come from and where we're going. So everyone will ultimately attain to a state of self-realization that is irreversible. But can there be hiccups in that process? Sure, why not? People can go forward and then go backwards. So that brings me to my last point, which is this. I don't believe at this point, and perhaps I could be persuaded otherwise, but I've thought it through quite a bit. Mortality is a function of existing in this manifest world of duality. It's not the result of a fall. It's simply the result of being manifested, being caused, not being the creator. So, and you see this even in the Bible, even in the Christian tradition, where Adam has to be, he has to overcome a litmus test. He has to go through some sort of trial by fire in order to be cemented in theosis. So even though he is without sin at the beginning, he's in a state of innocence. He's not immortal, because if he were in a state of absolute immortality, he wouldn't be able to fall. But the fact that he was able to fall meant that he was capable of dying from the very beginning. So I view things much the same way. We are mortal by virtue of being created. Not created in the ex nihilo sense of that term, but in the general dharmic sense of that word, or non-dual sense of that word. So I believe that when we are self-realized, we will attain to what I would call a state of conditional immortality, in which to continue living without dying in this individual existence, we have to continually partake of some divine substance that communicates life, or communicates, that renews us biologically. Much the way the tree of life existed for Adam in the garden, for him to eat, before he was expelled from there and not permitted to have any part in it. I believe that implies a continual eating. And that tree of life motif goes back much further than Genesis. It goes back to the Egyptians and the Sumerians and all of the ancient civilizations, the most ancient civilizations that we know of. And they had a recollection and knowledge of a tree that symbolically, maybe it was a tree, maybe not, but it symbolically referenced something that they had to potentially ingest in order to maintain longevity in the body. So that is my view on things, and I will close it out with that being said.